everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I'm here to talk through all of the books that I read in May. I actually read a lot more than it looks like I did in the thumbnail, so I'm going to start with all of the books that I don't have physical copies of before I forget them. So first of all, I finished one audiobook in May, and that was The Wee Free Men by Terry Pratchett. I tried reading The Color Magic a few years ago and didn't really like it, but I love Good Omens. And then one of my subscribers recommended this one to me, and I actually quite enjoyed it. It's part of the Tiffany Aching sub-series of the Discworld, I think. And so we follow Tiffany Aching, who is maybe 10 years old, give or take. And she lives on a dairy farm in a very rural part of the world. And she discovers one day that she may, in fact, be a witch. She suddenly starts having run-ins with all of these magical characters that she never knew existed before, and no one else seems to be able to see them. And the witch Granny Aching seems to think that she might be a witch. And then on top of that, her little brother Wentworth goes missing, and Tiffany must team up with the Wee Free Men to try and bring him back. The Wee Free Men are a group of magical creatures known as Pixies, which are very much caricatures of every Scottish stereotype known to man. About 6 inches tall, painted blue, red hair, kilted, very thick accents, and absolutely hilarious. And apparently not offensive to actual Scots, as Jean Mingus also loves this series. So it was your typical Terry Pratchett, silly, scary, and really quite enjoyable. The audiobook promised that Bill Nighy would be one of the readers, and sadly there wasn't a lot of him. I discovered he was only doing the footnotes. Indira Varma was our main narrator, who I also quite enjoyed, with another narrator whose name I can't remember, filling in the voices of all of the Pixies. Then I admittedly panic read 2 arcs in May as I let the deadlines get away from me. The first one was A Sham Betrothal by Jenny Goutet. This was part of her Georgians in Paris series, which admittedly I haven't read yet. This is the first one that I've read. And admittedly, they do work very well as standalones. You don't have to read them in order to enjoy them. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It's about a variety of English people who travel to Paris in the 1700s, and romance ensues. They are clean romance, if that matters to you. This one was interesting, as it seemed to take the fake dating trope and made it work for the 18th century, which I was really curious to see how they were going to do that. But it actually worked really well. I think she worked that quite cleverly. My only complaint was that everything moved so fast. There was enough tension between the characters. The tropes seemed to really work. It felt very sweet and very cozy, as you would want a romance book to be, but everything was resolved so quickly. I wanted us to stew in that tension just a little bit longer. I feel like it would have made the ending that little bit more satisfying, and we would have gotten to know the characters on a much deeper level. But as I said in my written review, it was very much a cute amuse-bouche of a novel. Then I also read the arc for Loyally Luke by Pepper Basham, which was another part of a series that I had never read before. I've never read anything from this author before, but both of these authors were recommended by a Bookstagram channel that I follow, which I will put an image of over here as the name is escaping me right now. And I thought this sounded intriguing and possibly cute. As I started the arc, I became a little bit wary of it, and I'll tell you why. So this is part of a series that takes place on the fictional island of Skymar. Skymar is very clearly an equivalent of the Isle of Skye, or one of the Hebridean islands in Scotland. But in this universe, Skymar has its own royal family. It has its own governance. And this series follows a collection of friends and family from a town in either Virginia or North Carolina, who all end up traveling to Skymar for one reason or another and find love while they're there. So already I was a little bit hesitant, going, this could be really great and bring me wonderful memories of Scotland, or this could be done really stereotypically and really great on my nerves. Luckily, it didn't do that at all. Everything was really beautifully done. There was no attempt to replicate an accent. None of the characters were stereotypical. Everyone felt really real, which I really appreciated. The second thing that made me a little bit wary was the fact that it was a Christian romance. Now, I am Christian. However, a lot of the Christian marketed books that I have read have tended to be a bit too heavy-handed. They tend to be a bit too Bible thumping, or have an extremely saccharine conversion moment somewhere, and that just doesn't sit right with me. That's not how normal people live their faith, in my experience. These books proved me wrong again. These characters did have strong faith, and it would be mentioned every now and again as part of their daily lives. And then they'd carry on with the rest of their day, and it was just so refreshing, and I was really grateful for that. So this is the third book in the series, but again, you don't have to read them in order. And this one follows Luke, who ends up going to Skymar as a consultant on a restoration project. He's very much into construction, carpentry, very much a flannel shirt, manly man sort of person. And he ends up falling in love with the princess of Skymar, which he doesn't realize at first, and has to navigate them figuring out what their relationship is. How long can she keep the fact that she is a princess a secret from him? How would he fit into so public a profile? And we follow her as she's trying to build a better reputation for herself. We discover that she had a bit of a rebellious time in her teens and early 20s and is now trying to, for lack of a better word, rebrand herself. And I just found these utterly charming and sweet. I blew through it in a day, and I'm actually really looking forward to revisiting these characters in the first two books, because we still do hear from them. We hear from them in long text conversations that Luke has with Izzy and Penelope. And I can get the other two books through my library on Hoopla, so I'm really, really excited about that. Then the last book that I don't have a physical copy of at the moment is The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. Apparently my mother is borrowing this right now, but I did finish it in May. And I remember talking about it a little bit at my end of April wrap-up, but I don't remember giving a full review. So here's my full review just in case. This book was beautifully written, and I think it was a really interesting premise to look at this portrait of a real duchess who I believe was also memorialized in the Browning poem My Last Duchess. And the combination of those two things led Maggie O'Farrell to wonder what actually happened to this young girl as she was married to this duke. Did he, in fact, kill her? And like I said earlier, Maggie O'Farrell always writes beautifully, and this book was no exception. There is that part of me that's still left with mixed feelings about it, and I can't tell whether that's just the plot itself or if there was something more that's niggling at me, and I'm sorry that I can't be more specific, but it was beautifully written. It was really gripping, but I also hesitate to say that I enjoyed it. Then, continuing my journey into the ACOTAR universe, I read A Court of Frost and Starlight by Sarah J. Maas. I've been reading these to catch up with a group of fellow teachers at work who also love them. And this was quite fun. I do agree with my coworker Brittany that this felt like a lot of filler. Really, I don't know that it was really necessary, but it does still give us interesting insight into some of the characters, their interior worlds, and I think it's set up nicely where we're going in book 4. Beyond that, I can't really give you too many details without giving things away, but if you missed any of my other reviews or any of the BookTube hype about these, this is a series of fae romance books, probably one of the first fae romance series. And these are not clean romances at all, but still have really interesting and well-drawn characters. And they're a lot of fun to read, so I'm enjoying discovering them. Then I ended up taking a reading detour that I didn't expect to, which was rereading Half Magic by Edward Eger. May is the month for standardized testing in most school districts in the US, and I ended up monitoring a room for 2 weeks, 3 days every week, and sometimes a lot of the kids were finished early, but they had to sit quietly and read, and after a while, so did I. And I noticed the teacher whose room I was covering had Half Magic on the shelf. And I remembered reading it when I was, I think, 9 or 10, but I hadn't read it since, so I decided to pick it up to model what reading quietly looked like. And then ended up rereading the entire thing and really enjoyed myself. This is a book, it's actually, I think, the first book in a series, but it follows 4 siblings who one day stumble upon what they think is just a coin on the sidewalk. But in fact, it's a magical talisman that grants wishes, but it only grants half your wish. So you have to play with fractions in order to get exactly the wish that you were hoping to make. And even then, when the wish is fully granted, it doesn't always turn out exactly the way that they'd expect. It is brilliantly witty and funny and just a fun adventure. And I remember reading another book in the series after this, and I have 2 of the other books in the series on my shelves, but I really don't remember what happened in them, so I may end up rereading those in the future as well. But these are just wonderfully fun. The cover illustrations here are done by Quentin Blake. The inside is also illustrated, though by a different illustrator, and that just makes it even more magical and fun, really. Then I read my monthly D.E. Stevenson book, so this month was Listening Valley. And this was quite an interesting book. It's quite a slow burn, not in terms of romance, but in terms of plot. We start out following 2 sisters, and then eventually peel off and follow just the one sister, who is always the more retiring sister. However, when the more outgoing sister gets married and leaves for India, Tonia is left alone, and she really has to come into her own through self-development, through education, through marriage, and then through living on her own. And during all of this, war is breaking out in the UK as well, so she has to deal with living in London versus living in Scotland during the Blitz. How does she volunteer for the war effort? It was really fun watching her bloom. Some of the romances do happen quite quickly. I think some of that was intentional and some of it isn't. And it felt like kind of a departure from the other D.E. Stevensons that I've read so far. But I wouldn't say it was a bad departure. It was just interestingly different. Still love her as an author, and I'm looking forward to discovering the last couple of books that I have from her, physically at least. Then for my non-fiction book, I picked up Billy Connolly's Gullible's Travels, which I believe is out of print. I picked this up secondhand through an independent seller on Amazon. And it was interesting, though it wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be more of his travel diaries, talking about things that he discovered about various parts of the world as he traveled doing stand-up in the 70s and 80s. But in fact, it was more just a collection of jokes that he had told as part of his act, themed around a variety of countries. So there were all of his jokes about being in America and the strange things that we do. A collection of his jokes about New Zealand, a collection of his jokes about the Middle East, a collection of his jokes about Scotland and Ireland, and so on and so forth, with a couple other topics that didn't seem to fit into travel at all, but they threw them in anyway. I am very glad to have this. I think it's a great collection of a lot of his jokes, so I'm happy to have it from that standpoint, but I don't know that I would highly recommend it. I think he's written other books and other collections of his jokes and his stories that are better done. Plus, the illustrations in here are really unnerving at times. I don't know what it is about the style, but it just really unsettled me. And then finally, I finished 2 days ago, The Square of Sevens by Laura Shepard-Robinson. I was really looking forward to this. I've really enjoyed some of her other books, and the premise sounded like it had everything that I could possibly want. It's set in the 18th century, starts in Cornwall, travels to London and a country manor house outside of London, following a young girl named Red, who has grown up telling fortunes with her father using this ancient method called the Square of Sevens, which apparently was a real thing. Laura Shepard-Robinson did a lot of research into this method of fortune telling in general in the 18th century. It's really beautifully researched. But Red grows up with her father until he dies at quite a young age, and she's left on her own. She's taken into care of a variety of people, but she discovers two things. Number one, that the Square of Sevens is incredibly valuable, and a lot of people would pay a lot of money or do a variety of really dreadful things to get their hands on that document. And B, that she is potentially the heir to a huge fortune on her mother's side, but her mother's family don't know that she exists. And so she begins to try and work her way up socially and worm her way into the family to try and claim her inheritance at any price. It sounded amazing. However, I felt there were two things really wrong with it. Number one, I felt like there were too many twists and turns. By the time we got to the 5th or 6th plot twist, when there were only 50 pages to go, that just felt like a bit much. And B, I had read in the acknowledgements that there were 4 fortunes that kind of gave structure to each section of the book. And each title chapter would tell you about one card of that fortune and what it meant. I found that really hard to follow, though. I mean, I followed the plot perfectly well, but I feel like it would have enhanced my experience had I understood where those fortunes were leading, and I just felt like that wasn't terribly clear to me. So those were all of the books that I read in May. Let me know down below if you have any thoughts about these books or further questions for me about any of them, or indeed if you have recommendations for me based on anything that I've said about any of these books. I always love to hear from you all, and until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.